it's kind of an unwritten rule. Oh yeah, kids can leave at this point in time, especially before I say these things. It's a bit of an unwritten rule for pastors or preachers that you don't want to talk about 3 topics if you want people to come back the next Sunday. And those topics are money, sex, and hell. And the good news for you today is we're not going to talk about money and we're not going to talk about sex, but we are going to talk about hell. And for some of you, depending on the environment that you grew up in, just seeing that word up there probably is bringing trauma to you, and you're thinking about, how do I leave without anybody seeing me? But don't leave, because if you grew up hearing lots of messages about hell, specifically messages that were trying to scare you into a love of God, this is going to be a different kind of message, and I'm glad that you're here today. We're in the second week of a sermon series titled Ever Wonder Why, and in this series we're dealing with some questions that people wonder about, and perhaps they're questions that you've asked yourself. And today's question is, why does God send people to hell? Or the way I think of it, why the hell would a loving God send people to hell? And I have an answer for that question, but before I answer that question, I need to go back to something we talked about last week, an idea that is key for where we're going to go this week. And so last week we looked at the question, why would God allow that to happen? And we asked that question in a bunch of different ways. One of the ways that we asked that question is, if God is loving, why would God allow suffering? And the answer to this question, if you first think about it, and of course we're all thinking, but if you first think about it up here, then it will end up, I think, begin to satisfy you down here. And the answer is this: if love is a choice, suffering is a possibility. And you might not think about love as a choice because, you grew up watching Disney and rom-coms and you want to fall in love, and I hope you fall in love. But really, if you think about it, love is not something you can fall into like a pool or fall out of like a chair. Love is something far more profound. In fact, real love begins to manifest when we love somebody, when we take action to care or do well for somebody, precisely in the moment when we're not feeling it. Anybody ever woken up in the middle of the night when you had a young child to change a diaper? You're not feeling that. You don't want to, oh, great, got to change a poopy diaper at 2 a.m. I'm just loving it. But we do these things in the moment when we're not feeling it. And if love is a choice, right, you're choosing to do that thing right in the moment when you don't feel it, you're choosing to extend yourself, then suffering is a possibility because we can choose to do the loving thing or we can choose not to. And from the biblical perspective, this is at the core of what it means to be humans. On page 2 of the Bible, we meet the first human beings, humanity and life, Adam and Eve. And they are given this choice. They are told that they can eat from all the trees of the garden, including the tree of life, and follow God's way and be in intimacy with God and have God's wisdom and protection. Or they can eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This represents the choice that all of us have to redefine what's right and wrong according to what's most convenient to us, to redefine what's ethical and unethical, what's moral and immoral in the moment for what is convenient to us. And God's saying you can either follow my way and be under my protection, or you can choose to go your own way. And if you go your own way, it's going to be bad for you. And I love you. I want you to be with me. But for there to be love and not coercion, it has to have a choice. And the first human beings, they, of course, choose their own way. And if love is a choice, suffering is a possibility. And it's always a choice between my own way and God's love. Perhaps, you might have a conflict with somebody, and you have a choice between being resentful or forgiving. And depending on what you choose, there's going to be a certain outcome. God wants to teach you to have an attitude of gratitude. I'm awake today. There was sunshine this morning. I have people here with me. I could have an attitude of gratitude, or I could just have an attitude. I caught a stoplight this morning. My Chicago Bears were terrible this year. There's always something to complain about, and it's a choice. You could have a choice between being generous with your life or being greedy. You have a choice between being selfless or selfish. And love is a choice. There's always a possibility between God's way, the way of generosity, of gratitude, of caring for others, of extending yourself, or my own way. And if love is a choice, there's always a possibility of suffering. One reason there is suffering in my life is I've chosen my own way over God's love, over God's wisdom. Maybe I'm the only one. The very next story after Adam and Eve, humanity and life, is the story of the first two brothers in history, Cain and Abel. And these two brothers, they bring a sacrifice to God. And Abel, he brings his very best, and God is well pleased, and it's a good experience. But Cain, he brings a half-hearted measure, and God is not pleased, and it's a bad experience. And Cain, he's pouting about the whole thing. And God approaches him, and he says, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? And the implication, if you read the story, it's really interesting. The implication is that Cain somehow has like this internal moral compass. He knows what's right. He knows what's wrong. Kind of like how you kind of know what's right and what's wrong. God goes on, he says, but if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. This is a powerful image. It's like a wild animal waiting to pounce on you, and it desires to have you. But you must rule over it. There's a way in which sin, the dysfunction of our life, it takes hold of us. But we must rule over it. Cain, of course, he does not rule over the sin in his life. And like many of us, when we feel shame, he casts blame. And he casts blame on his brother Abel, and he kills him. And God confronts Cain about the murder of his brother Abel. And God says there's going to be a consequence for this. And Cain says it's too much, and he asks for pity. But if you read the story, you'll notice he asks for pity, but he never repents. He never says he's sorry for murdering his brother. He never admits that he was wrong for bringing a half-hearted sacrifice. He wants pity, but he never repents. If you follow the storyline a little bit further, Cain, he has a son, and then he has a grandson, and so on and so forth, until you get to his descendant, this bad dude named Lamech. And Lamech's the first guy in the Bible to have two wives. There's not a whole lot in the Bible about Lamech. Who here has heard about Lamech? Very few people, right? But Lamech, he's a bad dude. And Lamech, here's the line that he says. He's got just a few words in the Bible. He says, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, that was God's measure of justice back then, not today. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. He's got his own standard. He's violent. And the world becomes so violent that God washes it away with the flood. But what this is showing is the fact that one person's sins, one person's failure to repent, to deal with the dysfunction of life, it can be passed on from generation to generation to generation. To put it another way, the evil of the world comes from the compounding. That means increasing intensification. From the compounding consequences of human sins. I wonder why there's evil and suffering around us? It's because individuals are failing to deal with their sins. They're choosing their own way, redefining good and evil according to what is convenient. It's okay to lie a little bit here. Nobody will know. It's okay to do this over here. Nobody will know. And that has this compounding effect that spreads throughout creation. Which brings us to the question, why does God send people to hell? And depending on the tradition you grew up in, you might say, well, because of all the evil and suffering and sin in the world. And while I can understand that perspective, I don't believe that's the answer. Why does God send people to hell? My answer is, God doesn't. And not every pastor, not every theologian would agree with me, but I'm not alone in this. Why does God send people to hell? God doesn't. And you might be thinking to yourself, whoa, hold on a second. Does Pastor Scott not believe in hell? Oh, no, I do. I believe hell is real. I believe hell is real for 2 reasons. 1, I think I've seen it. And 2, more importantly, Jesus taught about it. And we're going to talk about what Jesus has to say about hell today. Because what we believe about the end of life has a big impact on how we live our lives and see our lives. But if you want to learn more about this, I actually dug deep into this topic for 4 weeks in a sermon series preached in fall of 2021 titled, "Oh, Hell No." That's funny, come on. And so I go deep into that topic there, and I highly recommend that. So Matthew chapter 5, there's 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. Matthew is the first one. Matthew chapter 5 begins the greatest sermon ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, he teaches this. He says, "You have heard that it was said to people long ago," referring to the teachings of the prophet Moses, "You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." Any murderers here today? We're all in the clear. "But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." Anybody ever been angry? Yeah, come on now, raise your hand. You know you have. "And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." The Greek word that is used here is Gehenna. Gehenna. Now, you might be thinking, well, for murder, I can see why somebody would go to hell, but being angry feels a little bit extreme. Jesus is just getting started. Sometimes it's extreme. He says, "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" Anybody? I'm just kidding. I'm not going to ask you that. "But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Come on, Jesus, you got to be kidding me. He's not. "If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away." It's metaphor. He doesn't want you to self-mutilate. But he's trying to get at the severity of this issue. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to be thrown into hell, Gehenna. Now, what image comes to mind when you think of hell? Mine is forbidden donut. Have you ever seen this episode? It's so good. Homer, he's like this glutton, and he loves donuts, and so he sells his soul to the devil for a donut. And as long as he doesn't eat the entire donut, then he's good. But of course, Homer, he eats in the middle of the night, and he comes down and he eats the forbidden donut, gets thrown into hell, and then he's punished with the very thing that he covets. He's force-fed donuts over and over again. But the gag is that Homer's gluttony is greater than the supply of donuts in hell, and it frustrates the devil. This is great stuff. And the depiction here is something that theologians call eternal conscious punishment. That at the end of your life, if your tally of good things is lower than your tally of bad things, you're going to be sent to eternal conscious punishment. It's down somewhere below the surface. There's flames and all this sort of thing. It's going to be a final separation. That's the eternal. It's going to be an unending experience. And there's going to be a just retribution. You're sent there to be punished for all the sins and evil you have done. Now, in the Oh Hell No series, I talk a lot about this and why I disagree with this. There's a lot of smart Christians. Maybe you believe this. Maybe you're taught this. So respect for that, but I don't think that it's the right view of things. But my opinion doesn't much matter. More importantly is the question, is this what Jesus is talking about when he talks about hell? Gehenna. Because the word for hell in English, it gets translated as Gehenna in the Greek, but that's a translation of the term Valley of Hinnom in Hebrew, which is a physical place outside of Jerusalem. It had become a trash dump in the days of Jesus where they would throw the trash and they would burn it. So there's always flames in Gehenna. And they would throw the dead bodies of criminals and other people like that. So it's this terrible place, and nobody would build a home in this valley, and nobody would start a business in this valley. It was a trash dump. It was a terrible place. It was a place where things got disregarded. There's constantly flames. And to understand why this specific place was used for that purpose, we need to put the text in its context. Come on now. Ooh, context. Come on. Context is so good. We're going to go back to the Second Chronicles, your all's favorite book of the Bible, right? Second Chronicles, it says, King Ahaz, one of the worst kings of ancient Israel,
burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom and sacrificed his children in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations. The prophet Jeremiah, he talks about the valley of Hinnom as well. This is actually God speaking through the prophet. God says, they turn their backs to me and not their faces. If love is a choice, suffering is a possibility, we always have the choice to follow God's way and our own way. And God's saying, they turned their backs from me and started going their own way. And look what happened. They built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom, Gehenna, to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Moloch. What I'm telling you here is that hell is a place of human creation, at least the place that Jesus points to, Gehenna, the valley of Ben Hinnom, hell. And so when Jesus says, if you're angry, if you're full of lust, be really careful, because those are matters of the heart. And you better guard your heart so you don't create your own hell. Has your anger ever created your own hell for you? Sometimes I get in these arguments when I'm really, really angry. And I can't get out of them, and I'm in the car, and I'm arguing, making all my points. And if I could have a whiteboard in the car, I would draw it all out. And so I'm arguing, and I'm in the car by myself. Anybody ever do this? And you're trying to shake it. Jesus is like, careful. These things, they originate in the heart, and if you don't guard your heart, you will create your own personal hell, and it is a terrible place to be. I'm going to share with you two stories that Jesus tells that are stories that theologians point to when we talk about heaven and hell. The first one is found in Luke chapter 16. Jesus says there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. One commentary said that like a fine linen outfit could be as much as like a month or 3 months' wages. Like, $15,000 Gucci, or whatever it might be. So this guy, he is dressed so nice, he's living in luxury, he's eating well every single day, and at his gate laid a beggar named Lazarus, this disabled guy who's begging for food, he's covered in sores, and he's longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Guy living in extreme luxury, and then this guy that's in extreme misery. And Jesus is telling us that we have a person with an opportunity to be generous who instead chooses to be greedy with his life. They both die, Lazarus and the rich man, and they go down to Hades. And Hades does not stand for hell. It's the realm of the dead. And they're both down there, and Lazarus, he's up with Abraham, Father Abraham from the book of Genesis. But the rich man, he's down somewhere and he's in agony, burning, and he calls out and he says, Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus, the guy that used to sit outside my gate, he could serve me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in the water and cool my tongue because I'm in agony in this fire. Now, maybe this is a real story that Jesus is telling, but there's a lot of indications that it's another one of his parables. Jesus makes up these stories to tell us something really true about the nature of life and God. And perhaps this is real fire, or it could be an image for an experience that maybe you've had, where fire stands for burning with shame. You ever have that feeling of shame just come over you? It's like a burning sensation. You know you did something wrong. Abraham says, son. It's interesting. He's still included in God's family. Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here. He could have been comforted back there when you were walking around in purple and fine linen. You could have done something. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Now, at the end of our lives, according to the American psychologist Eric Erikson, we will have this struggle between a sense of integrity and despair. That's what the psychologist says. Something about the end of life something about getting older provokes us to reflect on our lives. And if we can look back at our lives and we can say, look, the values that I hold and the life that I live, there's some congruence between the two of them, and they somehow fit together, then you can have a sense of integrity. I mostly lived how I think I should live. But if you look back on your life and the values that you have do not match up with the way that you lived, you will struggle with despair. And I think that this man, it's just my take on it, I think this man, because he is forced to look back on his life without the blinders and the protections and all the stuff that we put around ourselves to make ourselves feel better, one day all those protections are gone, and he's looking back at it and he's realizing, man, I just lived a greedy life. And here was somebody suffering. And I don't think that people should live greedy lives. And I think that people should help with those who are suffering. And so he is in agony as he's dealing with this. But then Abraham says something to him that's even more frightening. He says, and beside all this, beside the fact that you miss your opportunity and all that, besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm, a great barrier has been set in place. And here's the thing. If you read this story, Luke chapter 16, you'll notice that this man, he does ask for pity, but he never repents. He never turns back around to God. He never asks for God's grace. He never deals with the fact that he has sinned and that he has lived this greedy life. Instead, he's still stuck in this mindset where he is to be served and things are to come his way. And we know that because, again, he looks at Lazarus as some sort of servant, as somebody below him. He says, send Lazarus to my family to give him a message. And this man's mindset is stuck. And his greedy life sent him to his own self-made Gehenna, hell. And people end up in that place. I said that I've seen hell, I think. One of the places that I've seen that, I was talking with Elena Lennon. Some of you know her. She's an intensive care nurse. I was a chaplain in a hospital. And sometimes when people are at end of life, there would be all sorts of people around them. And even though it was a death, it was somewhat beautiful. There was support and there was love and care and tenderness. But sometimes there was nobody. People were alone. And some of those people, because of the way that they lived, they drove everybody in their life, whoever loved them, away. And they're angry and bitter. And the room was dark even when the sunlight was coming through. And they had created a self-made Gehenna. It's very real. She had experienced it. We just talked about it. I have too. And Jesus leaves this man in that place. And some people, they end up in that place, and that's how they leave this world. I've met with more than a few. But I believe that it is possible to move beyond this place. And I believe that partly because of a story that Jesus told right before this. This is the final story, and we'll conclude. Jesus says there was a man who had two sons. Some of you know this story of the good father or the prodigal son. The younger son says, "Oh, Father, give me my share of the estate." The son's request for his share shows his selfishness. God, or Dad, I just want what's mine, and I want to leave. And this is a parable. And in a parable, you're always in the parable, and God's always in the parable. And in this parable, it's quite obvious. God is the father character. So this guy, he wants to leave. He wants his share. Give it to me. And so he leaves. And not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, and he set off for a distant country. And there squandered his wealth in wild living. He chose his own way, and then he wasted it. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the land and the whole country, and he began to be in need. And so he hires himself off to this foreigner to feed the foreigner's pigs. And for a first century Jewish person, this would have been like the worst thing that you could do. Just think of the worst job you could imagine, the thing that would just cut you at your core. Gary, as a Bears fan, this would be working for the Packers. This horrible thing, and it's a self-made hell for him. And he longed to fill his stomach with the pods of the pigs. This is so humiliating, but nobody gave him anything. Question for you. Who is responsible for this situation? The father, the famine, or the son? Hold up whatever your answer is. 3 fingers, 2 fingers, what do you got? Yeah, 3 fingers. The son. The son's hell was created by his own choices. And what we're going to see, it's under his own control. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I thought it was so oppressive living under my dad's authority. And I just had to get out there. I had to go my own way. And I thought he was holding things from me and keeping things from me. But now that I've been on my own for a while, it was pretty good. It's nice to come home, isn't it, Emma? Yeah. It's pretty nice here. And he's pretty generous. And so he decides to head back, and he starts rehearsing the speech. He says, he's rehearsing on the way home. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Cain and the rich man, they ask for pity, but they never repent. This man is repenting. He understands the gravity of what he's done and the consequences of it. And he's headed home. And then Jesus, who's telling this story, he says perhaps some of my favorite words in the entire Bible. The son's headed home, and then Jesus says, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. While he was still a long way off, still very distant from God, still living in a way and having an attitude that was far from where he needed to be, while he was still far away, while you're still far away, while I'm still far away, God sees us and is filled with compassion for us. And he, the father, ran to his son and threw his arms around him and choked him. How dare you spend all my money on all that stuff? Kissed him. Kissed him. Jesus gives more detail. He puts a robe on him and a ring on his finger, and he's like, this is my son. And the son, he's trying to, say his speech, I've sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you. And the dad is almost as if he doesn't need to hear it. The kid's home, and he's so happy. And then there's 2 sons, right? The older brother, he sees this party going on. And he asks one of the servants, what's going on? And the servant says, well, it's your younger brother. He's back in town, and your dad's throwing a party. And this ticks off the older brother so bad that he goes outside the house to pout, refuses to go in. So mad. And so the father went out and pleaded with him. Do you see what Jesus is trying to tell us? God's going out to find us because he wants to bring us in. And the older son, he's out there. He's full of anger, right? God says to Cain, be careful. Sin, it wants to hold you. It wants to keep you. It wants to put you in this place. But God, he's going to get him out of that place. The son, this is so great. This is so how I think many of us are, perhaps just me, when I'm angry. Look, all these years I've been slaving for you, Dad, and never disobeyed your orders. Never? Never? You never did anything wrong. Come on, right? Never did I disobey your orders. Yet you never gave me even one young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. You've never done anything good for me, Dad. You've always been terrible. Oh. Remember, Jesus says, guard your heart so you don't create your own hell. This kid is creating his own hell. His anger's got a hold of him. My son, the dad says, you're always with me. That's what matters. And everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. I mean, he was done. It was over. It was final. But he's alive again. And he was lost. And now he's found. And I love him. But if I'm going to love him, I have to give him the choice. And if love is a choice, suffering is always a possibility. And we can choose God's love, or we can choose our own way. And here's the takeaway, the bottom line. I just want you to hear this. I don't think God sends people to hell. I think God saves them from it. God is trying to save us from it. And so the question is, where do you need God's invitation to save you from the hell of your own creation? What is it in your life? What choices are you making that is creating this place you can't get out of? And you think it's gotten so bad that you can't leave. And you don't want to talk about it because it's too painful to talk about. But God's always given us this invitation. He knows, but while you're still far off, he sees you. And he's coming for you, not to hurt you, but to hug you, because he loves you. It's an invitation to come home. Where do you need God's invitation? I mean, maybe, you got some anger. Maybe you have a lust problem. Maybe it's a sexual lust. Maybe it's a lust for some other sort of thing. You got an unordered desire. Maybe you got some sort of issue with yourself and self-image, and maybe it's with somebody else. I mean, we have these things that begin to take hold of our heart. The Apostle Paul says this, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, while we're still far off, Christ died for us. He sacrificed for us. God doesn't send people to hell. He saves them from it. It's good news. Let us pray.